The stories paint knights as heroes and shining armor champions of honor, defenders of the realm, the embodiment of medieval nobility. But strip away the legend, and you'll find something far darker. Being a knight wasn't about glory. It was about surrendering your childhood to violence, risking financial collapse with every campaign, facing execution for a moment's hesitation, and knowing that even a minor wound could kill you slowly. This wasn't romance. This was survival in metal. Let me show you what it actually meant to be a knight in medieval Europe. Asterisk, asterisk, childhood stolen, asterisk, asterisk, picture a 7-year-old boy. In our world, he'd be starting 2nd grade, learning to read, playing with friends. In medieval Europe, if he was born into nobility, his childhood was already over. At 7, these boys were sent away from their families to serve as pages in the households of other lords. There was no negotiation, no tearful promise of return. The decision had been made at birth. These children would become knights, or they would be nothing. Life as a page was built on servitude. He waited tables during feasts, hauling heavy platters while grown men ate around him. He cleaned chambers, scrubbed floors, tended horses before sunrise. A spilled cup, a poorly groomed animal, a clumsy moment, any of these could earn a beating. But the labor was just the foundation. Between chores, pages trained with wooden weapons until their small hands blistered. They learned to ride without using their hands, balancing in the saddle while managing a lance. They memorized the code of chivalry, studied heraldry to identify friend from enemy in the chaos of battle. Every single lesson was preparation for war. At 14, if he proved loyal and capable, the page became a squire. The title sounded more prestigious. The reality was even more demanding. Asterisk, asterisk, the squire's burden, asterisk, asterisk. A squire was assigned to a specific knight and became responsible for that warrior's life. He maintained the knight's armor, every plate clean, every strap secure, every joint oiled. A single piece of faulty equipment could mean his master's death in combat. He cared for the knight's war horses, animals that cost more than most peasants earned in a lifetime. He trained with real weapons, now swords, battle axes, maces, crossbows, until his body moved by instinct. Most critically, the squire accompanied his knight into actual battle. When armies clashed, the squire rode alongside, carrying spare weapons, retrieving fallen equipment, fighting when necessary. He watched men die. He saw what a mace did to a helmeted skull, how a lance could punch through armor and pin a man to the ground while his horse galloped away. He learned that war wasn't glorious duels between champions, but chaos and terror, and the smell of wounds festering in the summer heat. This training continued for 7 years. By 21, if he survived, and if he could afford the enormous cost of his own armor and weapons, the squire might be dubbed a knight. But that ceremony didn't mark the end of hardship. It marked the beginning of a lifetime of obligation. Asterisk, asterisk, feudal chains, asterisk, asterisk. A knight didn't own his land. He held it in exchange for a promise, an oath sworn on bended knee, hand on holy relics. That promise was absolute. When his lord called, he would fight. No negotiation, no excuse, no refusal. Break the oath, and everything was forfeit. The standard obligation was 40 days of military service per year. But those 40 days meant abandoning crops, leaving home, riding to wherever the lord required, often with little notice. And a knight had to provide everything himself: equipment, horse, weapons, food. A full suit of plate armor could cost as much as a small manor. A trained war horse was worth several years of a common soldier's wages. Lances shattered in combat. Swords needed constant maintenance. For wealthy knights with large estates, these costs were manageable. For lesser knights holding only a single manor, every campaign risked financial ruin. They went into debt to equip themselves properly, borrowing from merchants or the church. If they lost their horse in battle, they might spend years trying to afford a replacement. If their armor was damaged beyond repair, they had to continue serving without it or face the consequences of breaking their oath. And 40 days was rarely enough. Wars didn't end on schedule. Sieges lasted months. Campaigns stretched across entire seasons. Knights were expected to continue serving beyond their obligation, from loyalty or peer pressure. Those who insisted on leaving after exactly 40 days gained reputations as cowards, men who valued comfort above honor. In this world, social shame could be as dangerous as any weapon. Refusal wasn't truly an option. A knight who defied his lord's summons faced immediate consequences. His lands could be seized. He could be branded a traitor. In extreme cases, executed. The feudal system allowed no room for conscience, no space for personal choice. The oath was everything. In medieval combat, a knight's conduct was constantly judged by his peers. Cowardice wasn't just failing to charge the enemy. It was hesitation at the wrong moment, retreating without orders, abandoning a fallen comrade, showing fear in any visible way. The line between tactical caution and punishable weakness was razor thin. Knights lived and died by their reputations. A warrior branded a coward lost everything that mattered in medieval society. Fellow knights would refuse to fight beside him, wouldn't trust him to hold a position in the battle line. Lords wouldn't grant him lands. Other nobles wouldn't offer their daughters in marriage. His family name carried shame that could last generations. In a world where honor was currency, cowardice was bankruptcy. Formal punishments were designed to be public and humiliating. A knight found guilty of fleeing might be forced to carry a saddle on his back through the army camp, mocked by common soldiers who would never have dared address him otherwise. He might be stripped of his armor in front of his peers and made to stand in his undergarments while his equipment was destroyed. His sword shattered, his spurs cut from his boots, his coat of arms torn and trampled. These rituals transformed the warrior into nothing. Military orders like the Knights Templar enforced discipline with terrifying efficiency. A Templar couldn't retreat unless outnumbered 3-1, and even then only if commanded by a superior. Violation meant immediate expulsion from the order. For men who had taken religious vows, expulsion was spiritual death. In one documented case during the Siege of Safed in 1266, a Templar sergeant caught conspiring with enemy forces was tried, hanged from the battlements, and left on display as a warning. His body remained there for days while other knights marched past. For secular knights, the most severe punishment was trial for treason. If a knight's cowardice led to significant losses, to the death of other nobles, or to military disaster, he could face execution. The method was often beheading, still considered an honorable death for nobility. But sometimes the sentence was more brutal, hanging or execution designed to maximize shame. Medieval armies also practiced decimation in extreme circumstances. When an entire unit broke and fled, commanders might execute every 10th man by lot, forcing the survivors to carry out the sentence on their comrades. This created collective responsibility, ensuring that knights would physically restrain each other rather than allow panic to spread. Fear of your fellow soldiers became as powerful as fear of the enemy. Asterisk, asterisk, death in the list, asterisk, asterisk. Tournaments were supposed to be training-controlled violence that prepared knights for actual war. But there was nothing safe about two armored men on war horses charging at each other at combined speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour, each trying to strike the other with a wooden lance weighing as much as a small child. The lances were blunted. The armor was reinforced. The rules were carefully established. Men still died regularly. Tournament armor weighed over 100 pounds, double the weight of combat gear. When a knight was knocked unconscious and fell from his horse, he landed face first in mud or grass, the weight of his armor pinning him down. If his attendants didn't reach him immediately and remove the helmet, he could suffocate in his own protection. But the true killer wasn't the immediate injury. It was what came after. Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of infection. When a lance splintered and sent wooden shards into a wound, physicians dressed the injury with honey, wine, vinegar, herbs, and waited for healing. Sometimes wooden fragments remained deep in the flesh, invisible, too small to remove. They became focal points for infection. On June 30th, 1559, King Henry II of France participated in a jousting tournament to celebrate 2 royal weddings. He was an experienced jouster, 40 years old. His opponent was Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of the king's Scottish Guard, who pleaded not to joust against his sovereign. The king insisted. During the third pass, Montgomery's lance struck Henry's helmet, shattered, and sent splinters through the face guard into the king's face and head. The king's physicians were Ambroise Parr and Andreas Vesalius, two of the most respected medical minds in Europe. They removed visible splinters, cleaned the wound, and believed the remaining fragments would work themselves out naturally. For 10 days, Henry declined. He developed fever, then terrible headaches, then confusion. On July 10th, he died. The autopsy revealed wooden fragments still lodged in his eye socket and a massive brain abscess, an infection that had traveled from the wound into his brain. The two greatest physicians of their age couldn't save him because they didn't know infection existed. Henry's death wasn't unusual. Leopold V, Duke of Austria, was thrown from his horse during a tournament in 1194. His foot was crushed beneath the animal's weight. Physicians amputated to save his life. Within days, he developed gangrene. The infection spread faster than the surgeons could cut. Leopold died in agony, his body rotting while he still lived. Knights continued participating in tournaments, despite knowing the risks, because refusing would have meant admitting fear, acknowledging mortality in a culture that demanded absolute courage. They watched friends die from infections that started as minor cuts, saw healthy warriors reduced to fevered wrecks over days. They knew any wound, no matter how small, could kill them slowly. And still they rode into the list because the alternative was living as something less than a knight. Asterisk, asterisk. The reality behind the armor, asterisk, asterisk. A knight's life wasn't a story of glory. It was systematic brutalization from childhood, financial servitude disguised as honor, the constant threat of execution for hesitation, and the knowledge that any wound might be fatal. The armor they wore was both literal and metaphorical protection that also imprisoned them in roles they could never escape. They were trapped between what society demanded and what their bodies could endure, between the myth of knighthood and the reality of blood, debt, and slow death from infections they couldn't understand. The next time you see a knight in a film or read about them in legend, remember the child torn from his family at 7, the warrior riding to bankruptcy with each campaign, the man watching a tournament scratch turn septic. That was the truth behind the armor.